They're ready? Okay, everybody ready for the jury?
Yes, sir.
Okay, bring them in, please. All right, jury's back. Please be seated. Good morning and welcome back. Again, if I could see by a show of hands if anyone has come into contact with information regarding this case since you left yesterday evening, please raise your hand. I see no hands. All right, members of the jury, both the state and defense have now rested their case. The attorneys now will present their final arguments. Please remember that what the attorneys say is not evidence or your instructions on the law. However, do listen closely to their arguments. They are intended to aid you in understanding the case. Each side will have equal time, but the state is entitled to divide their time between an opening argument and a rebuttal argument after the defense has spoken. Ms. Jensen.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court? Defense. Ladies and gentlemen. In July of 2015, Voncile Smith, Richard Smith, and John Smith were all alive and well. They were living, they were eating, they were breathing. John and Richard had done the same type of work for over 20 years. This family of three was minding their own business, staying to themselves, and taking care of one another for years. For years, and no one tried to harm them. Until that Tuesday, July 28th, 2015, when this defendant, Donald Hartung, already had in his mind that he was ready to retire. 58 years old. He wanted to cash in on his family's fortune. He wanted the money that he knew he was never going to get unless and until all three of his family members died. These murders were brutal, vicious, violent, and personal. You heard about the rifts in this family from the defendant's own son. This defendant was the black sheep. He was the outcast. He did not even have a key to the family's home. This defendant was excluded from his own mother's will. Does that not tell you how divided this family was? It was them, Bonnie, Richard, and John, against him. And then, when their heads were beaten and their throats were slashed, it was him against them. You've heard from the evidence. The Smith family was very unassuming. You would never know just by looking at them or what they drove or looking at their house, especially inside, that they had money. But they did. You have State's Exhibit 285 in evidence, dated March 31st, 2012, 2 months after Ms. Smith's husband died. You've got the account of John showing $213,000. The accounts of Mom showing $332,000. The accounts of Richard showing $349,000 for a total of almost $900,000. Can you just leave it like that?
Okay.
Thank you. No, if you just leave it like that, it'd be great. Thank you, sir. And this defendant knew about it. Because remember, he told his coworker, Mr. Bailey, that his mom was wealthy, and when she died, he was going to get the money, quit his job, and retire. And lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, 3 weeks later, this defendant submitted his letter of resignation. This defendant, and this defendant alone, had the motive to murder his 3 family members. That's the motive, so let's talk about the opportunity. Who knew John, Richard, and Bonnie's schedules that also had a motive to murder? That man. You've heard evidence that Bonnie, 78 years old, probably not in the best health, had fallen recently, which is why Richard had put the cameras up. She's always home, doesn't really go anywhere, sits in her recliner, orders QVC. Who knows that has a motive to murder? Donald Hartung. John Smith, you know he works at Walmart, had been there over 20 years, worked on Monday, was off Tuesday, Wednesday, worked Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Who knew his schedule that had a motive to murder? This defendant. Richard, you know, worked Monday through Friday, stayed late on Tuesdays because he didn't want to come home. He knew this defendant was at the family home on Tuesdays, and you heard the testimony of his coworkers. He was reluctant. He was hesitant. He did not want to go home because he knew that man was there. He worked late on Tuesdays. Who knew that also had a motive to murder? This defendant. The evidence has shown beyond a reasonable doubt that the deaths occurred on Tuesday, July 28th, 2015. You know that John's last day at work was that Monday. The Walmart employee brought the video surveillance in. He said law enforcement came to him and said, we need to know the last day that John worked, Monday the 27th. And what's interesting, if you think way back to the beginning of the trial, when law enforcement responded to the scene, they went and got Mr. Hartung, brought him back, and the officer that had been waiting there said, you know, do you think your family's here? You know, what can you tell us about him? And he said, well, the 2 cars are there, meaning Mom and Richard, so they should be there. This is on a Friday. Well, what about the other brother? He said he should be there too. This is on Friday. If John was alive, he would have been at work. This defendant said he was there because he knew he was there. That was the last place he left him after he killed him. You know, John was off on Tuesday, normal scheduled day off. You heard from the neighbor, Mr. Chittenden, who said he saw John, I think he said mid-morning, go to the street, get the trash can, and bring it back. So we know John was alive, obviously. You know that John missed his appointment, his doctor's appointment, on Wednesday the 29th. You heard from the office manager. He was a patient since 2003, missed his appointment, and this appointment had been confirmed. You have the video surveillance of Richard leaving work on July 28th, 2015 at 6:36 p.m. And look at what he's wearing. He is wearing the exact same thing when his body is found on Friday the 31st. And not only that, he's wearing his credentials. What does that tell you? He was murdered right when he got home from work. You heard the other employees. There is no reason to wear those credentials if you are not at work. You have Richard's phone records. His last outgoing phone record ever is July 28th, 2015 at 6:46 p.m. He called home. You heard from Tammy Duncan, his friend and his coworker, that said every day when Richard went home, he called his mom. No outgoing phone calls, no outgoing texts ever after that time. You have Voncile's pill case. Everything gone except for Tuesday p.m. You have the food in the oven. That is the food that this defendant cooked on Tuesday the 28th, still in the oven when the bodies are found on the 31st. You heard Dr. Minyard during the course of the autopsy She checked the stomach contents. John had corn and green beans. Mom had corn. Richard had crinkle fries. What did Richard eat that day with Tammy at Sonny's barbecue? She said either a hamburger or a pulled pork sandwich and crinkle fries. The outside trash has one bag of trash in it, ladies and gentlemen. You know that John brought the trash from the street Tuesday mid-morning. There is one bag of trash in that trash can. These are 3 people, a family. They are heavy. Obviously, they eat a lot. Not one other piece of trash in that trash can. And you heard from Mr. Chittenden, who said they always had a ton of trash, QVC boxes, QVC packages. 3 people, 1 bag of trash. What's in that bag of trash? The food that Donald Hartung cooked on Tuesday the 28th. There's also the paper in there, Tuesday the 28th. And then you heard testimony from the crime scene technicians that the Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday paper were still in the mailbox. To put it all in context for you, Monday the 27th was John's last day at work. Tuesday, you know the defendant goes to the Smith family home. The evidence shows that is the day that that family is murdered. You know Richard left work at 6:36. You know his last outgoing call was 6:46. He never responded to Tammy's text that night, and she told you that was unusual. Wednesday the 29th, John did not show for his doctor's appointment. Richard still did not respond to any text from Tammy. The Wednesday newspaper still in the mailbox. Thursday, John does not show up for work. Richard does not show up for work. Richard does not respond to any calls or texts from Tammy, from David Flatt, from his employer, from anybody. And remember, he's supposed to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No response. Thursday newspaper, still in the mailbox. On Friday the 31st, the bodies are found. Richard is in the same clothes that he had on Tuesday with his credentials. Voncile's pill box, all the pills are gone except for Tuesday PM. The Friday newspaper is in the mailbox. And the trash cans have trash can Tuesday only. Even the inside trash has defendant cigarette butts from being there on Tuesday. Cleanup from the food that was cooked. Blood from the cleanup of the murders. Look at the timeline, the details of what you know through the evidence that happened on Tuesday the 28th. You know, according to Donald Hartung's interview, that he arrived at the house a little bit earlier than normal. Obviously, he had a lot to do that day. Shows up earlier than usual. He says he had his dog. You heard from the neighbor, and you heard from Marlon Purifoy. Defendant did not have his dog. Hartung cooked. You heard that from his interview. You see the evidence in the trash, the food in the oven. We know John and Bonnie ate because you know the stomach contents during the course of their autopsy. Purifoy told you that this defendant removed the D-Link cameras that Richard had set up to watch his mom because she had fallen. This defendant killed John first in the den, beat him in the head with a hammer, slit his throat. You heard from Marlon Purifoy that this defendant told him that he tortured his mother by cutting her pinky in order to get safe combinations. How could Marlon Purifoy know that? The medical examiner didn't know that. Hartung killed Bonnie in the family room, in the living room where she normally sat, beat her in the head with a hammer, slit her throat. Now think about this. In the photos where John is situated in the den, he's sitting in the chair where he always sits, watches TV, and there is, pardon the description, but there is blood and hair and matter on those boxes behind him. There is nothing around Bonnie. Nothing. No blood spatter on the ceiling. No blood spatter on the table behind. Why? Because that's his mom. He put something over her head. Sheet, towel, something. Because no matter what he's doing, how horrible it is, that's still his mother. No one else is going to come in there and put something over Bonnie's head. He drug her body to John's room. Again, who else is going to do that? He covered John and Bonnie's bodies. You heard from the investigator that was talking to him. They thought it was because he didn't want to look at them. No idea about this concept of time of death or body temperature, right? Bodies are covered. Defendant goes through Bonnie's purse, gets the safe combinations. You heard testimony from Purifoy that this defendant may have gotten some money out of a safe. I don't think he specified which one. And then the defendant cleans up. There's evidence of food, blood inside the trash can inside the house. This defendant turned off those TVs. Who else is going to do that? Nobody. The TV in the living area where Bonnie was murdered, TV was off. The TV in the den area where John was found, TV's off. Richard leaves work 6:36. You know that from the video surveillance. We know at 6:46 he makes his last outgoing call. We know Richard arrives home from the neighbor's testimony. And at that point, this defendant ambushes Richard. He shoots Richard as soon as Richard walks in that den. Richard struggled. You heard testimony from Dr. Minyard. He has defensive wounds. His fingers are cut. He struggled. And who else told you that? Marlon Purifoy. How would Marlon Purifoy know that? He can't. Richard struggles. This defendant slits Richard's throat. This defendant grabbed Richard's belt to flip him over. This defendant stole Richard's keys and his wallet. You heard from Matt Enfinger that the wallet and the keys of Richard were never recovered in this case. Then the defendant covers Richard's body. Not as much covering as the others. Bonnie has 19 bags of stuff on top of her. John has 4. Richard has 2. Obviously, this defendant's got to get out of there. This defendant changes his clothes, puts everything in a bag to keep from getting blood in his car, goes through Richard's belongings, the black case, the checkbook. Hartung smokes a cigarette. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's in that exact order, but you know that there is a cigarette smack dab in the middle of that trash and 4 at the bottom. Throws that butt inside the trash. You know that from the DNA. And then this defendant left after Richard got home, according to the neighbor, and it was around twilight. Look at the evidence that you have to back that up. You have a picture of Bonnie's pinky. You have Bonnie's black purse mixed with the bloody paper towels that have her blood on them. You have a black purse in the trash can. It's got this defendant's DNA on the handle, greater than 700 billion. It's got this defendant's DNA on the latch. It is a match to this defendant's DNA. Now, if you recall, you heard from crime scene technician Masita. He took the pictures of the defendant's house. And he says when you walk in the front door, there's a shelf that you look at directly. And he said there's just this piece of paper on that shelf. Took pictures. Think about that. 25, 26, 28. One safe. 37, 42, 52. Second safe. You also have a photograph of a list that was in one of Voncile's purses in the trash. And it's a list of her medication. Can't ever get anything wrong. On this list of Bonnie's medications is the date, 7/27/2011. Look at the writing from that piece of paper found in the defendant's home and that piece of paper found in Bonnie's purse. Look at the 2s. Look at the 7s. Richard's safe was found opened. You know that there was a lot of money found inside. And you may be asking yourselves, well, why wouldn't he take all that money? Because he knows it's his. He knows that money is going to be his. He is the sole heir to this entire estate. According to Purifoy, he took some money out of a safe. Maybe he took some, maybe he didn't. Maybe he missed it. But whatever is in that house is going to belong to that defendant. And then, of course, you know that there was a safe found in Bonnie's closet that was missed by the sheriff's office. They didn't even know about that safe until Marlon Purifoy. You have DNA. And I know when the witnesses testified, it's confusing and it's complicated and it's messy and it's hard to understand. But bottom line is this. Richard's purse is found in the purse. His case, his fabric case, is found on the kitchen counter next to this hammer. And you know that that hammer tested positive for blood in 4 different places. The head, the shaft, the handle itself, and then you heard Jennifer Wilkerson, the state's witness, say she stuck a piece of filter paper kind of up in between the shaft and the handle, and it tested positive for blood. It also has Bonnie's DNA, John's DNA, Richard's DNA, and the defendant's DNA. And I'm sure, as the defense pointed out in the state's case, there are also some unknown areas of DNA on that hammer. But what you also heard from the DNA experts is that typically the person who last handled something or touched it the longest is going to leave the most DNA. So these areas where the DNA is unknown, as you heard from the witness, very small amounts of DNA that were unknown. And think about this too. Up until July 21st, 2012, Richard A. Smith also lived in that house. Bonnie's husband, Richard and John's dad, also lived in that home. You know that the back corner of the fabric case is Richard's blood. You heard testimony from David Flatt that Richard always had that case. Other than his keys and his wallet, the only other personal item that Richard typically carried was that black purse. And David Flatt looked at a picture and he identified it for you and said that is Richard's case. He either had it in his office or he had it in his car. You also heard from Tammy that Richard was OCD in his routine. His daily routine was OCD. He's not going to leave that case at home on a Tuesday when he knows this defendant is coming over. David Flatt told you that Richard kept financial statements, documents, what have you. You have all this in evidence. Nothing in that case has Donald Hartung's name on it, which means his DNA should not be there.
Let me ask you this. Did you touch any of RT's belongings?
RT's belongings?
Like personal belongings, his cell phone, anything like that? Did you touch any of that?
No, sir. I didn't.
So you said you'd never touched anything of RT's before?
Not Tuesday. RT wasn't there.
Ladies and gentlemen, RT was there. And RT came home before this defendant left. And Richard had that case at the time he was attacked, and that's why his blood is on it. You heard that this defendant's DNA is on these zipper handles on the case. Think about this. Mr. Griffith said in his opening statement, however long ago that was, that perhaps the case was on the counter while the defendant was cooking, and he moved the case from wherever it was to someplace else, and that's how his DNA got on there. Well, maybe the outside, but the zipper handles? And not only that, but on the inside, this defendant's DNA is on Richard's checkbook. Inside. And it's a match. And the DNA expert said that there was more DNA of this defendant on that checkbook than there was Richard. You also have this defendant's phone records. He makes very few phone calls. And you have those 3 on the 30th, and you heard that this time has to be converted by 5 hours. But this defendant calls Bank of America on July 30th, 2015, 3 times. Checking his bank account. Is it low? Bills are due. July 30th. And don't forget, Richard's wallet was never located, and David Flatt said he always had cash. He always had cash. He said hundreds of dollars in his wallet. The wallet's missing. David Flatt said Richard kept his wallet in his back pocket. And don't forget, obviously Richard has been moved. This pooling of blood right here, this area on his back, shows that he was on his back. He had to be moved to this position, and this is the position where he's found. And the back of the belt is lifted up. And then you know from the DNA witness that this defendant's DNA is on the inside of the belt. And that number is greater than 1.1 billion. Not only that, but you have this defendant's bank records. And on Thursday, July 30th, 2015, this defendant deposited $100 in cash at an ATM at Bank of America. He then deposited $900 in cash at an ATM on August 3rd. You've heard the testimony of the Deerfield Drive neighborhood. One way in, one way out. Klondike Road is the intersecting street. Same street that this defendant lives on, just a few miles away. You saw the front of the house, again, unassuming. Back gate has a lock on it that is unlocked. Who knows about the gate? Who knows about the lock? This defendant. He told Marlon Purifoy that he unlocked it to try and throw the investigators off. We've got a picture of the back door. Back door is closed before anyone went in, meaning crime scene, and that becomes important because of the time of death and what the experts testified to, the area temperature, the room temperature. This door is shut. Back door is always used. When you go in through the back door, you go into the laundry room. No signs of forced entry. Now, I suspect through the cross-examination that Mr. Griffith did of some of the witnesses that picking the back lock with a credit card is considered forced entry. And think about this. If some person is going to break into this home and beat these people in the head with a hammer and slit their throats and shoot Richard and slit his throat, are they really going to sit out there with a credit card and try to pick it? No signs of forced entry. This is going to the back door of the residence. There's the thermostat up here. It's hard to read. It says either 87 or 82. Again, off from what their expert was considering in determining the time of death. When you come in, if you look to the left, the back door is going to be this way. If you walk in and look, this little half bath is back there. Great place for this defendant to be lying in wait for Richard to get home. Go into the den. Again, here's the thermostat and the time that crime scene went in, which shows 1:49. Got the den area. You've got the area where John is found, always sitting, watching TV, just like this defendant said. You've got the area behind him, obviously not covered up like his mother was. And then this picture just gives you a good perspective of where that bullet was found. This is where the bullet was found. So think about this. Picture Richard standing up, facing the person taking this picture with his back to that lamp. Think about that. Then you go into the kitchen. I forgot to put a picture of the dog food and dog bowls, but there's water for the dog. There's food for the dog. Who leaves food and water for a dog? A person who loves dogs. Then you go into the family room. This is Voncile's chair. Staged. There's blood underneath that blanket. There's blood down by the side. Again, no spatter. This isn't the greatest pictures, but if you look at the dining room, look at the ceiling, no blood spatter. TV off. Why were the TVs off? John and Bonnie are killed in their chairs while watching TV. This defendant knew Richard worked late on Tuesdays. He knows that at some point Richard is going to be on his way home from work. He knew approximately what time Richard gets home. He knew that he had time. Don't forget, he went there earlier than normal. He knew that he had time before Richard got home. He turns the TVs off so he can hear when Richard comes home. Same reasons that Bonnie is moved. What strange random person is going to come in and move this lady from her chair where she was murdered down a hallway and into a bedroom? Nobody. For all the same reasons, that's why she was moved. This defendant knew he had to move Bonnie so that it wouldn't alert Richard when he got home. You've got John's room with the mounds of stuff piled on top of Bonnie. Rug that was taken from the living room. Now think about this black trash can. Well, actually, why clean up? All the same reasons that the TVs are off and Bonnie is moved. This defendant doesn't want Richard to notice that anything is out of order. So think about that black trash can. This is the wall to the right of the den, outside the kitchen area. Does that not look like where the trash can probably would have been? You throw stuff in there, it misses, hits the wall, leaves some stains, right? The trash can is moved, and this little rooster is staged. And the trash can is moved behind the door to the den. That is not where that trash can is going to normally be for these three people. Behind a door to a den. This defendant moved this trash can and then forgot to take the trash with him.
Do you smoke?
Yes, I do.
What kind of cigarettes you smoke?
305s.
305s?
Yeah.
What are those in those purple packs?
Yeah, got one right here.
Let me ask you this, what do you do with the cigarettes when you're done with them?
Throw them in the trash.
He forgot to take the trash. Because right smack dab in the middle of the cleanup of food and the cleanup of the murders is a cigarette with his DNA. You also have the other 4 cigarettes that have his DNA. When Investigator Infinger interviewed Mr. Hartung and asked him, questions about his timeline, what he was doing that day, what time he got home,
Told her, I said, Mom, ain't nothing on here. I said, I'm going to get Zena, we're going to head on out. And that's the same thing I do every single week. And that's when we left.
What time do you think it was when you left?
6 o'clock at late, maybe 5:30, between 5:30 and 6, maybe right in the middle, somewhere right in there.
What'd you do when you left there?
I went home. I had my dog with me.
What'd you do when you got home?
Went to the mailbox,
And what'd you do?
went in the house, sat down, opened up the coat, turned on the TV.
What'd you watch when you turned on the TV?
I don't really. I mean, it was more just on than me watching it.
You have the same routine every Tuesday.
I have the same routine every day, practically. Not just Tuesday.
Everybody has shows that they watch.
Yeah,
Even I do.
yeah.
What?
Usually I watch 5.5 ETV. And
What is your favorite? What channel do you usually watch the most?
oh, I watch 5-3 in ETV the most, but I don't pay that close attention to the
When you
TV.
went in and sat down,
My favorite shows are all the westerns.
what do you usually watch on Tuesdays?
It just depends on what's on. I flip around until I find something I like.
Usually it's the same thing every Tuesday.
No,
Same shows are always
I don't
on
really
about
have
the
a
same time.
favorite. I don't really have a favorite show that I watch on Tuesday.
So you can't tell me what you watched? So, I mean,
Well, no, I can't tell you what I watched. Not for sure. I can tell you. I can tell you that I watched. Well, I mean, if I take a think long enough, I might be able to remember. But let's see. I can't recall.
What time do you think you left?
Well, I mean, I didn't leave right then. I was there for a while. I'd say I probably left maybe 5:30, 6 o'clock. And you asked me a question earlier about what I was watching on TV, and I just turned the TV on. I really wasn't paying attention to it, but it was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? How appropriate. This defendant had days to rehearse his timeline. What time he went there, what time he left, and it's always the same. But when he's asked about something specific, he can't come up with anything because it's not true. And what he did in between the time of the first interview And the time of the second interview is go figure out what comes on at the same time that he's supposed to be home. Who wants to be a millionaire? You heard from Mr. Chittenden. I would call him maybe a nosy neighbor. You heard his testimony. He was so detailed in the information that he had. And he explained why. He's retired. He sits outside. He takes note of his neighbors. He's bored. He told you that he saw the defendant come over on Tuesday as usual. Nothing abnormal. But what he did say is he did not see the dog in the car. And he told you every Tuesday when that defendant came over, he would see that boxer sitting in the passenger seat of this defendant's car. He did not see the defendant's dog that day. He also said, normally on Tuesdays, he would see the defendant's boxer running around in the backyard of the Smiths. There's a chain link fence in between his yard and the defendant's family's yard. Never saw the dog running in the backyard that day. He was not positive on times, and he explained to you why. He doesn't wear a watch. He's retired. He gave up watches a long time ago. But what he was absolutely 100% certain is that Richard came home while this defendant was still there. The defendant kept telling law enforcement that it was between 5:30 and 6 o'clock when he left. Mr. Chittenden said it was twilight, and he explained to you what that meant. The sun is going down, but it is not quite dark. And you know in the summer months, it stays lighter late. And you have a document and evidence that's certified that shows sunset on July 28th, 2015 was 7:46 p.m. And again, when Mr. Chittenden saw this defendant leave, after Richard came home, Mr. Chittenden did not see the dog in this defendant's car. Mr. Chittenden told you he did not see anybody since that Tuesday, July 28th, 2015. The cars did not move. Richard's car was parked kind of weird. He described that for you. That car did not move since Tuesday, July 28th. This is State's Exhibit 247, and the reason this is in is because you can actually see Mr. Chittenden peering around the corner. You also heard the testimony from Mr. Chittenden. This is his house. This is where his front porch is. It's the Smith residence. This is his house for perspective. The Smiths would be to the left. He saw this defendant come to the Smith residence as normal on that Tuesday. And then when the car, gets to a certain part, if he's sitting on the porch, he can't see into the driveway. And then he told you that he saw Richard come home, actually saw Richard's face in his car, saw Richard pull up. And then, again, not having an exact time, but he told you everything he did, helped his wife with dinner, changed his shoe, whatever he said. And then, after all of that, he saw the defendant leave and head out the same way that he saw Donald and Richard come to the Smith house on that day. These are pictures of the backyard. If you're standing in the Smith backyard, this is Mr. Chittenden's yard. Obviously, you could see if there was a dog back there. This is standing on the Smith back porch, and again, just showing the perspective from Mr. Chittenden's view.
1 p.m., right?
Around there, yeah. Maybe.
Was it raining that day or anything?
No, because as soon as I got there, I started playing with the dog.
Okay. So you got there around 1. When you got there at 1, did you go in the house at all?
Well, I was always.
Did you go in the house first and let them know you were there, or what'd you do?
No, I don't ever do that. I just started playing frisbee with Zena.
Okay. How long
And then,
did you
I don't
did?
just a few minutes. You know, I throw it for a few times, and then I go in.
Do you take the dog in or you leave it in the backyard?
Seen stays have some bears in the house.
Who?
Bear.
That white dog?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he can't say that his dog was inside the house, and that's why Mr. Chittenden didn't see it, because his dog is never inside the house. Think about the testimony that Mr. Purifoy gave you. It is consistent. The state is not trying to suggest that Mr. Purifoy does not come with baggage. Obviously, he's a convicted felon. Obviously, he got help. Well, he doesn't think it was help, but he got a cap of 30 years for his charge. He still got that maximum of 30 years. But he is hoping that the state will file a motion on his behalf and ask that that 30 years be reduced. He's got baggage. But think about the testimony that he gave you and the things that he could not have known if this defendant didn't tell him. This defendant told you that the defendant said that he left his dog home that day because he knew what he was going to do. The name Zena, nowhere in any reports. Mr. Purifoy talked to this defendant about Wicca. He acted like he was involved in voodoo. This Wiccan talk was interesting to him. He said they kind of laughed at Mr. Hartung. People were scared of him. They thought he was a witch. So Mr. Purifoy engaged him in conversation about Wicca, said he was into voodoo to get him to talk about this Wiccan stuff. Mr. Purifoy told you that he knew that this defendant's son was molested by John. You heard this defendant's own son testify that that in fact happened. He said John exposed himself when they were children. You heard Mr. Purifoy say the defendant was upset because Bonnie didn't believe him. He started hating his mom. He also hated her because she treated him differently, because him and his brothers had a different father. How can Mr. Purifoy know these intimate details about this relationship? Donald Hartung Jr. wasn't in jail with Mr. Purifoy. This defendant was. Mr. Purifoy told you that Donald Hartung knew that he was out of the will because his mother told him. That made him mad. She also left the defendant's son out of the will. And again, you know that's accurate. You have the will. Bonnie did not provide for this defendant or his son. How could Purifoy know that? That made the defendant mad. Mr. Purifoy said that the defendant's mom told him in 2012. Well, what do you know happened in 2012? That's when Richard Smith, her husband, and John and Richard's father died. He told that to Mr. Purifoy. There's no other way for Mr. Purifoy to know that. The defendant admitted that he killed them. He wanted the money. He knew the money would go to the brothers. Because I asked Mr. Purifoy, well, why didn't the defendant just kill his mom? If he wanted mom's money, why didn't he just kill the mom? Because he knew that he was out of the will and the money would go to the brothers. He knew they had money, and he had been planning this for the past 3 to 4 years, which again is consistent when the father died. Father dies, everything goes to mom. Mr. Purifoy told you that this defendant said that although he had been planning it for this number of years, the Ouija board is what made the defendant do it. His words. Mr. Purifoy said that he knew the defendant went earlier that day. Time not exactly right. He's not perfect. His testimony is not perfect. He knew the defendant cooked. He knew the defendant took some cameras down, that they ate. He killed John first. John was watching TV in the den. He was hit in the head. His throat was cut. Mr. Purifoy told you that this defendant tortured his mom to get those combinations. He cut her finger. She said the combinations were in a black purse. Now, of course, Miss Wilson picked apart that he said old purse, black purse. Bottom line, it was a purse. Hartung killed his mother after John. She was in the front room watching TV. He hit her in the head. I think he said cut. That's my word. I think he said cut her throat. And then he got money out of the safe, I believe he said in the mom's closet. And again, law enforcement had no knowledge of this safe before Purifoy. Mr. Purifoy said he waited for Richard to come home. He, meaning the defendant, that this defendant killed Richard last, that Richard was a big boy, that he weighed 300 pounds. That's why he had to use a gun and shoot Richard. He said this defendant told him that he used a silencer so that the neighbors wouldn't hear, that the gunshot didn't actually kill Richard, that Richard put up a struggle, and that he cut Richard's throat. This defendant told Mr. Purifoy that he knew where the safes were, he knew about the money because he always snooped around the house. Mr. Purifoy told you that this defendant said he put clothes on the body so that they couldn't tell the time of death. How could Marlon Purifoy know that? He is not a medical examiner. He is not a pathologist. He probably doesn't even know what time of death is. All he knows is what this defendant told him. The defendant put his bloody clothes in a bag. He already had clothes at the house. He, meaning the defendant, and that he gave everything to a Wiccan priest on 9 Mile Road. And again, that may sound so fantastic to you and a stretch, but again, you heard the testimony of Wainwright, who said, after talking to Marlon Purifoy, he went in search of this Wiccan priest, and he found one off of 9 Mile Road. I want you to think about the injuries to the family members. Because not only are they violent and vicious and brutal and personal, but you know that John and Bonnie were sitting down when they were attacked, okay? So let's think about Richard. Think about how tall Richard was. 6'5". Extremely tall, or at least much taller than the average person. The bullet wound to Richard's head went in his ear and out the side of his head in a straight, horizontal level. No angle. So how tall does the person have to be that shot Richard? In the ear, at a straight level. That person has got to be at least as tall, if not a little taller than Richard. This is the injury to Richard's head. Went in his ear, went on the inside of his ear, out the back, and then through his head and then out the back side of his head. And remember I asked you to think about this picture. Think about Richard standing up. His back's going to be to this light, facing the person taking this picture. There's a ledge right here. Mr. Hartung is standing there as he came out of the half bath. Richard went in the den, sees John. He's covered up. He doesn't know exactly what's going on, but something is amiss. Here's Hartung from behind him, turns around. This defendant's on this ledge, fires the shot, straight, horizontal shot through Richard's head. I know this has been a long process for you and for everyone. I thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Mr. Griffith, do you need a short break to set up?
So, yes, sir.
Couple minutes? Okay, we're going to take a short break at this time. Please be seated. Mr. Griffith, you want the lights to remain like this? Be in recess in 5 minutes, so 10:15.